You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 21st of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
The way to prevent it is to dismantle all the infrastructure of Iran's nuclear program.
Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, in the middle of a major incursion into Gaza, is now reportedly planning to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, all without US backing. Later in the show, we'll hear from the head of a US-based election observer group on the state of democracy in the US and abroad. We'll get the latest business headlines, and after that,
the U.S. needs to get its debt down, period. There's no debate. No matter how it's done, it needs to be done.
Our contributor Charlie Bell visits Wall Street to hear how markets are reacting to Trump's big, beautiful bill. We'll also turn to a new high-speed rail project planned for Vietnam's two biggest cities. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Over the past few days, Israel has doubled down on its determination to take full control of Gaza, regardless of what the international community may think. And today there are reports that it may move even further afield with plans to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. All of this is happening amid increasing isolation, including, perhaps for the first time since Hamas's October 7th attacks, signs that the US is growing weary of Israel's actions and the devastating impact on Gaza. Trump, of course, avoided Israel in a Middle East trip earlier this month, and Vice President J.D. Vance cancelled his own trip in response to what's happening in Gaza. Joining us now is Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Yossi, always good to have you on this program. Let's start with what's been happening in Gaza. Tell us about what Israel is doing there that has prompted this severe international response.
Good afternoon, Chris. I think there are two aspects to this. One is Israel mobilized tens of thousands of reservists with the aim of what they call Gideon's Chariot operation, which is broadening the operation with Gaza, aiming at taking more and more, and it's already doing that to a certain extent, taking more and more territory. And it depends who you listen or believe to in the Israeli government. Is it, as you know, the clip that you just played about keep so-called destroying Hamas, or as if the finance minister and others from the right wing say it's about taking over Gaza and pushing 2 million people to very small parts of Gaza and eventually make them to despair to the extent that they will ask to leave. Now, obviously, what we see in the reaction international community, it's an accumulation of things. We saw only last week Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations, speaking to the Security Council and warned against war crimes in Gaza and the fear of starvation. So the international community, after more than a year and a half, 19 months of this war, thinks enough is enough, and it's time for not only ceasefire, but to end the war.
And in addition to that, what can you tell us, Yossi, about these reports of a strike on Iran and its nuclear facilities? These are coming, of course, as Iran's nuclear negotiations with the U.S. are gathering steam.
I mean, it depends again how you read it. To say that Israel is prepared for an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is not new. You can say it for the last 20 years almost. Whether this is operational and whether Israel is ready to conduct such a strike without the United States, this is a different matter, and that's some of the report suggests. Bear in mind that there's still some sort of diplomatic process between the United States and Iran, though the Supreme Leader of Iran said yesterday that he sees very little chances of the diplomatic efforts reach a positive conclusion. And I think also the mixed signals from Washington, as we are getting accustomed over the last few months, it's whether there is a chance from the United States to reach an agreement which is satisfactory for both Iran and the rest of the international community. Is the United States going to ratchet up the sanctions or even working with Israel together over a military operation? I think at the end of the day, all these options are still on the table. I think what was suggested from Tehran that basically talking about a military attack by Israel is a sort of increasing the pressure on Tehran to make concession in the negotiations with Washington.
Yossi, how much do you think it will matter to Israel that the U.S. is at this point doing things kind of behind Israel's back, whether that's negotiating with Iran or with the Houthis for that matter before that as well? And in reverse, how much does it matter to the U.S. that Israel is doing things without consulting the United States? I mean, both of these, in terms of also their administrations, they're quite nationalist, frankly, in a way. They want to do things their own way. So as long as military aid continues to flow, will it matter that the relationship is breaking down the way it is?
Yeah, and I think it's important for both, but of course more for Israel. The United States had been its main ally for many, many years. And if other countries see that the United States turns its back on Israel, it creates for them the space to also increase the pressure on Israel, as we've just seen in the last 24, 48 hours. I think the fact that President Trump visited the region, but not Israel, the fact that yes, he reached an agreement or declared a ceasefire with the Houthis in Yemen, but it didn't include stopping, in principle, attacking Israel. And that negotiating with Iran, despite the displeasure by Netanyahu and the Israeli government, showed there is a completely independent thinking in Washington, and it's not susceptible, for instance, as the Biden administration and even the Trump first administration, to any advice or pressure from Bibi Netanyahu and from the Israeli government. There is a sense that the United States is also fed up with the way Israel conducts the war in Gaza and generally operates regardless of what also serves U.S. interests.
And Yossi, at the same time, when it does come to European threats of sanctions or the UK, say, ending or suspending trade talks with Israel, how much will that matter to Israel as long as the US, whether it is diplomatically isolating Israel or not, continues to support it financially and militarily?
So, had there been a rational government in Israel, which I doubt it right now, it should have mattered a lot. If you start losing your main ally that provide you with weapons, pays for it, give you the backing in the United Nations against a resolution that called to end the war, or many other resolutions that matter for Israel, and now you start gradually chip away from this relationship. The EU, which is Israel's main trade partner, together with the United Kingdom, if there is a build-up, and in the middle of the war there is also heavy economic price to pay, I think again a reasonable government will pay attention. However, this is not a normal government. This is a government, as we said many times, over with a prime minister faces a corruption trial. His main aim is not to serve Israeli interests, but to serve his own interests, to stay in power and potentially out of jail, which made him very vulnerable to demands from the far right. And the far right have a very extreme ideology and strategy, which is at the end of the day to completely control and annex the Gaza and the West Bank, and from their point of view, preferably even without Palestinians.
Yossi Mekelberg of Chatham House, thank you very much for joining us. Now here's Anita Riota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The European Union has announced funding to support Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in a bid to save the pro-democracy outlet. This comes after the broadcaster lost U.S. public funding. However, the €5.5 million emergency funding will not cover Radio Free Europe across the globe, only in select European and Asian countries. Japan's first military show featuring land, sea, and air equipment begins today in Chiba City. The exhibition and conference, hosted by the Defense and Security Equipment International, comes as Japanese companies look for partnerships that will allow them to tap into overseas defense markets. New Zealand's loosening of its golden visa rules has led to a surge in applications, mainly from the U.S. The new scheme, in place since April, removed English language requirements and asks applicants to spend a minimum of only 21 days in the country to establish residency. This is down from 3 years. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Anita. Vietnam's largest private firm, Vingroup, has proposed a high-speed railway that will connect the capital, Hanoi, with Ho Chi Minh City, the economic center in the south of the country. It's an ambitious plan exceeding $60 billion in cost and will require international backing, but if they do pull it off, it would reduce the current travel time between Vietnam's two largest cities from over 30 hours to just around 5 hours. Project aims for completion by the end of 2030. And I'm joined now by Michael Tatarsky, a journalist based in Ho Chi Minh and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter. Michael, thanks very much for coming on the show. Tell us more about this project, first of all. How developed are these plans?
Sure. Just quick point. I mean, this has been proposed by the government or at least discussed by the government for some time. So it's not a totally new proposal by Vingroup, but the potential involvement of Vingroup is certainly notable. While we're talking about it, so the government has been talking about this high-speed rail, which, as you said, would be from Ho Chi Minh City to Hanoi, 1,500 kilometers in total. And I think the government's original cost was about almost $70 billion. Vingroup has actually come in saying it would be just over $60 billion. Mostly in the form of a government loan that they would pay back over several decades. And so again, this would previously been an entirely public project, and now Vingroup, through their VinSpeed subsidiary that they just founded, would take this on as a largely private project, which is hugely ambitious. Nothing like this, even close to this, has ever been done in Vietnam, and is obviously causing a lot of generating a lot of conversation.
It's certainly generating conversation because of the ambitious nature. As you say, nothing like this has been done before. What would it mean, though, to Vietnam if they can pull it off, to cut travel times between north and south as much as this would propose to do? What kind of impact would that have on the economy?
It would be huge, no doubt. I mean, Vietnam is sort of perfectly shaped for high-speed rail. It's, if any of your listeners have seen the map, of course, it's kind of long, almost in a straight line. You can connect pretty much all the major cities by train on like one line. You wouldn't even need multiple tracks. And as you said, I mean, road connections between the two major cities. I mean, driving isn't even an option. There's a very old national train that has basically been almost unchanged since the French era. That's when it was built. So even that takes about 30 hours to get from Ho Chi Minh City to Hanoi. As a result, flying is the main way to get from one end of the country to the other. I think the Ho Chi Minh City Hanoi route is routinely in the top 5 busiest in the world in terms of flying. So if you could connect these other cities, tourism centers, things like that, very quickly, it would drive growth in all of them and take pressure off roads and certainly airports as well.
So Vingroup has basically established this company now in order to build and operate this high-speed rail. They do need to raise $60 billion, and part of that, I understand, will come from international partners, Japan, China, Germany. Who do you see involved?
Yeah, this is kind of the big question, and especially on the finance side. I mean, this VinSpeed proposal is basically saying all finances will be domestic, although it should be pointed out that a $45-50 billion loan from the government is about is a significant percentage of national GDP. I mean, I know that wouldn't all be used in one go, but that's not a check that the Vietnamese government can just write. But on the technical side, they're also going to need tons of support. I mean, Vietnam, of course, does not have high-speed rail. No Vietnamese companies have been involved in high-speed rail. Both China and Japan are kind of the most obvious potential partners. I mean, China, of course, has the world's largest high-speed rail network at this point. Japan's Shinkansen is rightly famous for its service and quality. The China aspect of it is a bit complicated. Vietnam and China have a very complicated relationship. I mean, in many ways, they're very close, but the general public has kind of historical distrust of China and its potential involvement in domestic issues. So it's kind of hard to imagine Chinese companies taking part in this, given that it will stretch the entire length of the country and, be in many cities. Can't be ruled out, but that's kind of the big question, especially which I haven't even mentioned, the extremely condensed timeline that Vingroup has proposed, which would be construction starting this year and finishing in 2030. That construction start date is a year earlier than even the government had proposed. And I mean, it's ambitious, laudably ambitious, but frankly, a bit hard to see that happening, even under the best of circumstances. And that's in kind of any country, not just Vietnam. That's an enormous undertaking for just 5 years. But yeah, so this sort of international technology partner is, there's a lot of outstanding questions, but that's one of the big ones.
Vingroup planning to come in under budget and under timeline from the government. We'll see how that works out. Michael Tatarski in Ho Chi Minh, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. After the year of elections that was 2024, this past weekend here in Europe saw another wave of interesting elections from Romania to Poland to Portugal. All are coming at a pretty unique time for the democratic experiment, with many autocratic nations taking the lead in geopolitics and even the US facing some serious questions about the state of its own democracy and support for democratic institutions and agencies around the world. For more on this, I am joined here in the studio by Tony Banbury. He's the head of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. It's a Washington-based nonprofit that works with electoral officials around the world to boost their democratic institutions and electoral systems. Tony, it's great to have you here in the studio in London. I'm going to start with this weekend of elections that we just had. What did they tell you?
That every year, in a way, is the year of elections, especially for the countries that are having those elections. The presidential elections in Romania, obviously hugely impactful. What is especially unique and interesting about the Romanian elections is the ones that were canceled by the Supreme Court last year. And it's the first time in history where presidential elections were canceled, not because of problems on polling day, but because of problems before the elections had even taken place regarding misinformation and disinformation and efforts to attack the integrity of the election. So it was great to see these Romanian elections come off well. The Polish elections came off well. Portugal's also. There are some important elections still coming up later this year. A lot of eyes on Moldova and the elections there in September. But so far this year, the elections have been administered rather well.
Well, if 2024 was the year of elections, we might say that 2025 is the year of dealing with the aftermath of those elections, particularly in the U.S. And so I do have to ask you, Tony, given that you're based in D.C. as well, how has that been going?
Well, from a perspective of a non-governmental organization that provides assistance in countries around the world, I'd say it's been going rather poorly given the dramatic cuts to U.S. foreign assistance. And it's not just the reduction in resources being made available, whether it's for maternal and child health or democracy promotion. It's also a rapid erosion of the values failures of what the United States has in different administrations of different parties for many years asserted to be quite high priorities, such as democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And what I hear from partners I've been meeting in the past week in Europe and in other contexts around the world is a real sense of abandonment by the U.S., by their partners, their friends, their partners in a democratic struggle. And whether it's European governments providing democracy assistance or it's countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East that often receive such assistance to try and strengthen their democracy, that sense of abandonment runs deep and will, I fear, do a lot of harm to the U.S. government's ability to work with their partners on issues where they do still have a common agenda. And that's, to my view, sort of the most pernicious and probably far-reaching impact, in addition to any kind of measurement of the dollars that have been reduced or the programs that have been stopped.
And it is also because, in addition to cuts, say, to foreign aid, this is about specific pro-democracy groups, isn't it? You've seen a focus on, say, the National Endowment for Democracy and certain think tanks in the U.S. You've seen this play out with Radio Free Liberty and Voice of America. How does that impact what you do? How important is it for the perception of the U.S. as an upholder of democracy?
There's no question that the democracy sector has been significantly impacted. Efforts to end funding for the National Endowment for Democracy, cutting the all democracy assistance coming out of USAID. But I don't think the democracy sector has been singled out because we see it across so many other sectors in foreign policy and in domestic policy areas. Important democratic institutions have suffered, but also universities or law firms, civil society in the United States, research. So it's kind of across the board. And a big question that remains unanswered, but we will likely have answers to in the coming months, is how the U.S. Congress is going to address this issue. They need to pass a new budget for the next fiscal year. In theory, they need to do that by September 30. So what kind of law, legislation, appropriated funding will the U.S. Congress pass on democracy? The U.S. Congress traditionally has been a very strong proponent of American support for democracy around the world. What will the level of that support be in the next year's budget will say a lot about where does America go from here in the area of democracy promotion.
So one aspect is the U.S. funding and kind of how civil society groups are banding together in the U.S. But the other aspect for a group like yours is when you then go abroad and you go into other countries. Aside from the questions I'm sure you always receive about what's happening in the United States, how does it impact your work, your role when you are out there? Because I could almost see it two ways, right? If the U.S. and certain government-funded democracy groups are losing funding, then there's even more of a need for electoral assistance. But at the same time, as we've been talking about, there's the challenge of U.S. perception that can certainly impact the way you're perceived as well.
Yeah, it's a very big issue for our donor partner governments. It's certainly the case that they don't want to or feel obliged to step in and fill the gap left by the U.S. That's not their responsibility, and that's not our view that they should. We believe that we can still work in close partnership with them to advance common objectives that these governments share with IFAS regarding democracy promotion and electoral integrity. But they also are trying to assess the impact of these U.S. steps. For our national partners and countries we work in around the world, they feel that sense of abandonment, betrayal, dislocation, confusion. Why is the U.S. doing this? They thought, for all its imperfections, at least the U.S. always stood for democracy. How can they be taking the these steps that seem to perhaps benefit anti-democratic forces. So a real sense of disappointment and betrayal. But in some ways, what's even more risky is how anti-democratic forces are reacting to this. And those reactions tend not to be overt in the newspapers or in speeches by government leaders, but certainly anti-democratic forces, Russia, China, others, are seeking to capitalize on this to show that the U.S. is an unreliable ally, that even the U.S. government has questions about democracy and non-governmental organizations that support democracy. And it's creating a real opportunity for Russia, China, and others to exploit the space that has been left by the U.S. to counter efforts that have been sustained over many years of international and domestic organizations to advance democracy. So there's tremendous damage being done behind the scenes that is not as apparent, but it may well have the greatest impact.
Tony Banbury of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, thank you very much for joining us here in the studio. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is time now for a look at some of the business headlines with Bloomberg reporter Ewan Potts joining us. Ewan, always good to have you on the show. We're going to start with a spate of cyber attacks here in the UK. What have we heard, particularly from the retailer Marks & Spencer?
Hello, Chris. Yeah, results today from Marks & Spencer's, the 140-year-old staple of the British High Street. Now, the company's turnaround plan is going very well. It reported its best pre-tax profit in 15 years. But the good news was overshadowed by its update on a very nasty cyber attack, which has been causing havoc at the company. Online clothing and home orders, which account for more than £3 million of sales per day, have been suspended for much of the past 3 weeks. And M&S reckons the disruption is going to continue into July. The cost of this one attack on M&S, £300 million. And it's actually the third retailer just here in the UK to see disruption, with the Co-op chain and the London department store Harrods also dealing with attacks. But those three attacks really underestimate the sheer scale of this problem. According to one estimate, cyber attacks have cost UK businesses £44 billion in the last 5 years. And the same report reckons that half of UK businesses have suffered at least one cyber attack during that time. So it's all a massive problem. It's a massive global problem, which companies of any significant size really need to be prepared for.
That is a massive cost to retailers here in the UK. And Ewan, we did want to stick with costs for retailers, but going to the other side of the Atlantic, because there has been a growing argument spat between Walmart and President Trump.
Yeah, Chris, this is a nice Bloomberg opinion piece by our columnist Andrea Felsted. Last week, the world's biggest retailer warned that tariffs are going to force it to raise some prices. And the world's most important politician responded in characteristic fashion by telling Walmart to eat the tariffs. Now, this is a problem and a big dilemma for a lot of American companies. Remember that tariffs haven't gone away. President Trump has suspended his massive package of tariff increases, but there are still hefty tariffs, particularly on Chinese products. On average, import taxes the US are currently around 50% on Chinese products. Now, a lot of that hasn't quite found its way into the supply chain, but it is coming very soon. So companies are going to have to decide whether to suck up those price rises, take a hit to their profits, or to pass it on to consumers. And I think the danger from a macroeconomics perspective is the risk that companies respond with what's been in the past dubbed greedflation, just like they did in the wake of the pandemic, by pushing up prices by more than their costs. If consumers are expecting prices to rise, then it's easy for companies to sneak in a bit of extra padding and increase their profits at the same time. And we also know from surveys that the trade war is preparing Americans to pay more on their everyday purchases. According to the University of Michigan, consumers are expecting prices to rise at an annual rate of 7.3% over the next year. That's the highest reading on that since 1981. And the worry for economists and for central banks is that once those inflation expectations become entrenched, well, that leads to greater pay demands and a spiraling effect of more cost increases and more price rises. So very interesting story, I think, to watch over the next couple of months.
Absolutely, and we will continue watching that story out of the United States. Ewan Potts, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing. And finally on today's show, we are going to stick with the view from the financial world about the U.S. because the credit rating agency Moody's downgraded the U.S. economy on Friday. That was the first time in more than 7 decades. And yesterday, the big, beautiful budget bill, which is set to add more debt to the nation's already ballooning budget deficits, began its passage through Congress. From New York, Charlie Bell, our contributor, asks whether the U.S. economy has a case of the Moody Blues.
We've already said
Moody's downgrade came at a crucial moment ahead of a huge week for
the one big, beautiful bill. We love that bill.
Which is set to be voted on by the House of Representatives by Memorial Day. That's next Monday. On Capitol Hill, Sunday night, the bill finally found its way out of committee.
Well, tonight the House Budget Committee took a critical step to passing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and making President Trump's America First vision a reality for the American people. So let's go forth and deliver.
It only just made it by one vote, and then only because 4 hardline Republicans, unhappy that the bill increases debt, sat on their hands. Monday morning, the White House downplayed Moody's decision.
I want to get the president's reaction to Moody's downgrading the credit rating of the United States.
Sure. Well, look, the president talked about this over the weekend. The Secretary of Treasury also talked about it. When you look at the world has confidence in the United States of America and our economy once again. So there's a lot of optimism in this economy, and the president disagrees with that assessment.
The administration argues that other rating agencies made similar downgrades years ago, and the world's appetite for US bonds stayed healthy. But Professor Jason Furman from Harvard says there is one big difference this time.
The first one, S&P, was all fears that government dysfunction. We'd just gone through the debt limit. There was this question of whether political paralysis could lead you to not pay the debt back. This time, it's unified Republican control, and what Moody's is concerned about is what those unified Republicans will do. Right now, they are set on increasing the debt, with the only debate being by how much.
Another difference is the scale of today's debt, a staggering $36 trillion. The budget bill's tax cuts alone are set to add nearly $4 trillion more over the next 10 years. This increase in debt coincides with the Chinese government's tactical response to the tariff war. Despite calls from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to refrain from weaponizing their Treasury holdings to undermine the dollar, March data shows Chinese sales of $27.6 billion of long-term bonds. After a 5-month-long fire sale, China now holds 3rd place among foreign owners of US Treasuries, behind the UK and Japan.
So I'm standing outside the stock exchange. It's just after 4 o'clock and the markets are closed for the day, and we managed to eke out gains today. The Dow Jones was up.
In the end, a jittery and wobbly market righted itself, but away from the markets, the downgrade's effect was already being felt in the pocketbooks of ordinary Americans, as the price of borrowing immediately increased. Experts suggest interest rates will rise to 7% this week, up from 6.8%. A New York real estate broker I spoke to lamented the effect on an already soft housing market. The mood is muted outside the stock exchange. Traders leaving the building look relieved, but are tight-lipped and glum. A couple of old hands were willing to talk. Together they have decades of experience. The first I spoke to was called James.
You know what it is? They're way behind the 8 ball because Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. in 2011. It's like we're kind of late to the party.
Do you think it would have had an effect today on the trading?
Early it seemed yes. Lately it's bouncing up. This is like a reordering. And instead of us discussing policy and trying to figure out what works best and what's enough and what's too much, what is the right idea if you're going to put tariffs and what isn't the right idea, we're stuck with two sides. Either you're for Trump or against him, which isn't really helping anybody.
But in the meantime, the dollar's weakened, the mortgage rates are going up, the people are paying the price?
Temporarily. I mean, the mortgage rates were higher 4 or 5 years ago anyway. I'm from the 70s, so I remember 20% mortgages, so I'm like, okay, well.
Borrowing credibility of the U.S. is still strong?
I think it's strong, and I think, if anything, this puts more pressure on them to get their act together. The U.S. needs to get its debt down, period. There's no debate. No matter how it's done, it needs to be done.
For Christopher, things were more concerning.
I mean, it's a problem, and it's going to apparently raise rates long term, which is not good for the mortgage market, making it even more difficult to purchase homes, especially with the supply being as low as it is, and now with rates not coming down in the near future. I hope these kids are ready.
What about the Chinese? Do you think they've been dumping bonds to make things worse for people?
I don't know. I think there's always been some type of competitiveness, legal or illegal, over the years. But we'll get through it. It's a great country, right? God bless America.
Both brokers seemed pretty complacent. Complacency in the markets and in the central banks are a worry too for Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase. You all think they can handle all this? I don't think they can, he said to investors Monday afternoon. On Tuesday, President Trump was on Capitol Hill, twisting Republican arms to pass the bill, downplaying divisions.
We only have one or two, but we have tremendous support. But I'm a cheerleader for the party, and we're going to go up, and I think we're going to have a very good discussion. There are 1 or 2 points that some people feel strongly about.
But the truth is, there was no deal done on the Hill. This time, the bill faced opposition from the SALT Republicans, who represent districts in Democratic states, angry that the bill limits tax breaks for their richer constituents. And as for the markets, Tuesday saw them fall, anxious about the lack of a deal and uncertainty under darkening economic skies.
We've already said
Charlie Bell in New York. Thank you very much for that report. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Francesca Jokes, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Termek. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.